So again, welcome to The Truth About Nutrition, our 5th session in our series about the truth about nutrition. And today we're going to be going over all things mindful eating and intuitive eating. As mentioned in all of our webinars, if you need or want captions, please know that that is an option for you. You can find that button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and just depending on your device, you might just have to hover over the bottom part of your screen to be able to select that tool. With you today is myself, Nikki Johnson. I am an extension educator for the University of Minnesota Extension, as well as North Dakota State University Extension, and spend most of my time in community health and nutrition. And the star of the show today, Susie.
I don't know about the star, but I'll take that. Thank you, Nikki. My name is Susie West. I'm a health and nutrition extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. And my primary areas of focus are in food access, and I also work in mental health, particularly in recovery settings with those with substance use disorder. We're glad you're here.
Yeah. So before we dug into all of today's content, we thought it'd be maybe a little bit helpful to just kind of briefly go over all of what we've talked about over the past month. I know we've had quite a few of you who have been to multiple sessions, so we just kind of thought, let's go through some of the messaging and things that we've talked about nutrition, and then kind of lead us into today's topic about mindful eating and intuitive eating. So as mentioned, we've gone over a lot of nutrition topics this month, how food fuels us, a lot of facts and myths about nutrition and what that means for each of us. And I think it's pretty safe to say that there's been this like common theme among our entire nutrition series, and that is we hear a lot of conflicting messaging around what we should and shouldn't do as far as our nutritional health. We hear a lot about nutrition from those around us who maybe aren't necessarily equipped with the right information. And part of that is even because nutrition as a science is new. As we learn more things through research, and as experts learn new things, our recommendations might change too. And sometimes it's just hard to keep up with that. And it might seem a little bit confusing. We also talked a lot about food choices and what they might or how they might benefit or may not benefit our overall health. We kind of kicked off this series learning about macronutrients, carbs, fats, proteins, and how each of those plays a crucial role in our overall health. We also talked about the benefits of fiber that it provides to us. You guys probably remember that's one of my favorite topics to cover. But then we moved into learning about kind of how each of those food choices plays into a diet or a healthier overall eating pattern. When we looked at popular diets, we really were looking at things you maybe should look out for when you're trying to make those shifts into healthier eating habits. What's maybe a red flag? What are some components that maybe would fit and are good for us? And then finally, last week, we spoke about the importance of healthy eating patterns and what that really entails. Changes that are sustainable, choosing foods that fuel our body more often and choosing processed foods less often. Thinking about balance, variety, and nutrient density. And as we've gone through each of these topics, something that myself as well as my co-presenters have tried to convey and acknowledge is that while we know a lot about the things that we should do and how it might benefit us, the relationships that we have between our food, ourselves, and our culture is very complex and multi-layered. So today, as we start talking about mindful eating and intuitive eating, you'll notice we're kind of shifting gears from delving into specific diets and eating patterns and really focusing more on how we interact with food and the process of eating. So with that, we've got our first factor myth. We'll see if we can get you. Mindful eating and intuitive eating are non-diet approaches to interacting with food. Fact or myth? Our crew's got this down. They're just like immediately throwing it in the chat. I love this.
So smart.
And I was gonna say, and they're getting it correct.
We gotta toughen up our questions.
I know, we've said that all along. We did have one tricky one last week. But you are all right. This is a fact. So in general, Mindful eating and intuitive eating refer to a collection of habits, skills, and behaviors that are not diets or even aimed at weight loss. Now, while these approaches are sometimes used in conjunction with weight loss efforts, they are more so featuring what experts refer to as adaptive eating styles. And we'll dive into some of the similarities and differences of these two adaptive eating styles in the webinar, as well as some of the research behind each of those. So you might be thinking, like, what on earth is a non-diet approach to eating? Well, both mindful eating and intuitive eating are considered non-diet approaches to health. They teach us to really pay attention to and really appreciate the body's internal hunger and fullness cues. Mindful eating and intuitive eating also encourage people to take notice of how they are interacting with their food, as well as that process of eating.
Yeah, and so some of the reasons that, non-diet approaches to healthy eating are gaining more popularity, is because these skills and behaviors can really help improve your overall health, regardless of what your eating style is. So applying some of these skills and behaviors can improve, your relationship with food, might improve your relationship with your body and yourself, as well as improving overall health. And we're going to talk about some of those health benefits. But Nikki and I also just did a webinar a couple weeks ago about yo-yo dieting and fad dieting, and how those can really be detrimental to your overall health, even though they might result in weight loss, or they might not. They could result in further weight gain. They can have some really serious consequences for mental health and overall body health. Things like bone density and that kind of stuff can be impacted by engaging in those. And so having some non-diet approaches to healthy eating, or just eating in general, can be really helpful for people who have been stuck in this kind of cyclical yo-yo dieting, fad diet cycle. But we also need to touch on too this piece about weight stigma and body dissatisfaction and disordered eating that is really rampant in society, and a lot of things around weight gain or being in a larger body are really perceived as negative and hold a lot of cultural power and cultural sway over how we feel about ourselves, how we look at others, and those are harmful. We know that experiencing weight stigma is harmful and can lead to things like increased binge eating and beyond like weight status. Body dissatisfaction and body image are also really important parts of our mental health that can be impacted again by those cultural influences, and also disordered eating, which is really, really prevalent. And a lot of the fad diets that we talked about feature really heavily on disordered eating patterns. And so having this kind of non-diet, kind of more free approach to food, and also in coming back in tune with our bodily cues, can be really important and really empowering for people, although it can be challenging. But non-diet approaches are also gaining acceptance as meaningful and really evidence-based approaches to supporting overall health, including, your diet and your eating pattern, but also honoring that mental health portion as well. So we're going to dive into what that might look like, and we're going to start off with mindful eating. All right. So when I say mindful eating, want to know what kind of things have you heard about mindful eating? If you want to throw some stuff in the chat just so we can get the juices flowing, is what we have heard about mindful eating. Could be hard. Anybody else heard anything? Not being distracted by TV. Yep, that's a popular one. Eating when hungry, stop when not. Gaining awareness. Wow. Okay. So yeah, you guys already get the picture. Great. Love it. We're going to move into our little fact or myth. So y'all have already touched on this. Does mindful eating, fact or myth, does it mean involve paying attention to what you're eating? Fact. Too easy, Nikki. It was too easy. And that's a fact. Paying attention is to what you're eating is one part of mindful eating. Nikki's going to explain a little bit more what mindful eating also consists of.
So let's start off with mindful eating and thinking about what we might hear about this type of practice. And I think a lot of times people say things like, "Oh, I'm trying to be mindful of what I'm eating," and they're really referring to some kind of monitoring of the health of the things that they're consuming. In fact, as I was like thinking about this is something I know I've said this exact statement before. I know I have. And while that can be an adaptive eating behavior, it isn't mindful eating in its true form. Sometimes we also might hear or think about mindful eating as monitoring or similar to like an 80-20 eating, where people try to eat about 80% healthy and 20% maybe less healthy items. So there's kind of a ranking system, if you will. And then there might be other people who are also referring to portion size or their overall food intake when they're talking about mindful eating, or maybe even generally restrained eating when they think of mindful eating. And while some of these behaviors are normal and healthy, but when they are used by themselves, when they're used alone, they're not mindful eating. And it's even possible that when we're adhering to just one of the practices above, it can turn into a slip towards that disordered eating, where a person begins ignoring those hunger cues and restricting their portion size under this guise of eating mindfully. So then what is mindfulness? And what does it really have to do with food? So mindfulness is the ability to non-judgmentally observe the goings on in your body, brain, and environment, including your thoughts and emotions, completely free of shame or guilt, and then noticing them with gentle awareness. And I want to just like pause for a second. I feel like sometimes when I read that or I think about that, it takes a moment to settle in. Another definition is thinking about mindfulness as the capacity to attend to a phenomena on a moment-to-moment basis, non-judgmentally, and with accepting, relaxed awareness. And you might be thinking, as I'm talking about mindfulness, like this word mindfulness on its own is kind of a buzzword, but there's really good reason for that. So mindfulness as a practice is low cost. It is low risk, and it's a practice with centuries-long track record of helping people get more in tune with themselves. And more recently, data is there to support its usefulness in addressing a variety of concerns, whether it be stress, pain management, body image, or even mood. So what does it look like? Some components of mindful eating look like this. You're going to be really focused on the act of eating and not things such as calories, fat, carbs, and protein, right? Rather, we're thinking about that process of eating is related to when and how, rather than the outcome driven things like most diets or other ways of eating are. Mindful eating keeps in mind the ability to stop when you are full and the awareness of experiences and sensations of eating, recognizing external food cues, emotional responses, and attentiveness to eating. So to break that down a little bit or to think a little bit more about this piece about being more aware of the things around you and be thinking deeply. This might look like considering the wider spectrum of your meal. You know, where did your food come from? How was it prepared? Who prepared it? Noticing those internal and external cues that affect how much we eat. How was my body feeling? How's my mind feeling? Noticing how the food looks, tastes, smells, and feels in our bodies as we eat. I know that's a practice I really am working on because there's so many times where that's the last thing. I don't even recognize that I ate the food or what it felt like or what it tasted like because I'm not being mindful. I'm rushing through. It's also maybe acknowledging how your body feels after eating the meal, expressing gratitude for the meal, maybe even using some deep breathing or meditation before or after the meal. Really There's a lot of different interpretations and applications of mindfulness to eating that could be characterized as mindful eating. And it's a skill set that can be practiced and learned. Learning to recognize those hunger cues, those fullness cues, recognizing those different types of factors that prompt eating. Maybe it's stress, snacking while watching TV, or just grabbing something because the food is around, or it might even be those emotional responses to food. So know that this practice can be learned. It is not typically used as a weight loss tool. However, it might be used again in conjunction with weight loss or another type of therapeutic intervention. So what are the benefits of mindful eating? Mindful eating is generally considered an adaptive eating behavior and doesn't have many, if any, risks associated with it. So low risk and it's free. Many of these benefits overlap with just general mindfulness benefits. So cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, improved mood, and decreased anxiety. It could also be helpful for engaging with bodily cues that prevent those maladaptive eating behaviors. Most research shows that it is beneficial for those who binge eat. And it works because it helps to make sense of that, gaining awareness of how and why we're eating, right? And can help those individuals to reduce that. And finally, looking at some of the limitations of mindful eating and research. So the results of mindful eating interventions on things like weight loss, cholesterol levels, glycemic controls, and maybe some of those other health markers are mixed. We need some higher quality, longer, larger studies in a lot more diverse populations to be able to make a lot of those health claims. And oftentimes we know that when we're thinking about a way of eating, sometimes those health outcomes are the ones that we're looking for. And while we don't have the types of studies that we need yet, mindful eating does seem promising for some of those options. There are also a lot of theories about how and why mindful eating seems to be helpful for some and not for others. But we know that food choices and eating habits really are complex. We don't eat a food in a vacuum, where there's a lot of things in our life that are influencing our diets and our food choices. In addition to that, our brains are really complicated. So it may be a while until we're really able to articulate how all of this interacts.
And you might be curious, like, how do I try it for myself? What kind of tools are out there to explore this further? And actually, U of M Extension happens to have a mental flourishing toolkit that includes a little section about mindful eating, but it also includes a lot of other really useful tools for overall mental well-being. So I would encourage you to explore that toolkit. And I think Nikki put in the chat, or is going to put in the chat, a link to she did a little video and section about mindful eating, and it's really great. It's a little exercise that you can run through yourself. There's also a lot of like free tools online. You could like Google mindful eating meditation or mindful eating practice, and just, I would encourage you to try it. Take some time, try it, take 5-10 minutes and see what that feels like and what kind of things it might bring up. And again, it's about that non-judgmental awareness of the physical and emotional sensations associated with eating, the look of it, the texture, the taste, the smell, the temperature, the memories, and the emotions that it brings up. And I was looking for pictures to use for this slide deck, and I saw this picture of this little chick, and she's got her slice of watermelon in her adorable watermelon dress. And it looks like there's like some corn in the background, like a cornfield in the background. And immediately I was like taken back to 4th of July at my aunt's house. She had a pool, and that was like the best thing ever. And it was like, we were in the pool, running to the trampoline, grabbing something to eat, whether it was popsicle or watermelon, because she also grew watermelons. And we were sticky and covered in juice, and our fingers were all grubby. And I can like smell the hot, humid air on the cornfield, and I can smell the chlorine and the sunscreen all mixed together. And, also I'm really ready for some sunshine and for it to not be 20 degrees. So this was extra like enticing. But like food can really hold on to those crucial memories and like really transport you. But also thinking about like, wow, I can't believe my aunt and my uncle were growing those huge watermelons and they were so good. And so you might even, this picture might even bring up some stuff for you, some memories, or even just that image of like the fruit itself. And that's kind of the nice thing about mindful eating, is it can transport you to place that was really positive. And I also want to acknowledge that like with anything that involves becoming more in tune with ourselves, it can also make us uncomfortable and it can be challenging. And so I don't want to negate that if you try this and you're like, yeah, that was hard and I didn't like it, that's totally valid. It's not going to be necessarily easy, but the nice thing is that it expands our ability to sit in discomfort and explore some of that discomfort in a way that could improve some other aspects of our lives. And like mindfulness in general, that's one of the things that it does. And now I think we are going to move into intuitive eating. And I want to know, when you hear about intuitive eating, when you think about it, what do you hear about intuitive eating? What's going on out there in the world that y'all hear about intuitive eating? Throw something in the chat. Hopefully my listening to your body. Indeed. Listening to your body's needs. Yes. What? Understanding, not restricting, knowing when to eat and when to stop. Yeah. Knowing what's good for you, not just something you should be eating. Yeah. Intuitive eating kind of throws us into some gray areas. I'm so confused by this. Yes. Margaret, hitting on that nuance. What am I really hungry for? Aha. Okay. So intuitive eating, some things that you might hear. I already hear that some people are kind of confused. It gets thrown around a lot on I say Instagram because that's where I consume most of my social media, but it's on the TikTok and the Facebook and the other places too. And there are a lot of people who are like, I'm eating intuitively, intuitive eating. But it can also seem kind of vague, like what actually is this? Why am I want Skittles, but should I eat fruit? What do I do? And for some people, it could appear to be chaotic or like an unhealthy eating style. And I want to note here that this is particularly true for people in bigger bodies when they say that they are eating intuitively. There's a lot of pushback on social media in particular. Again, that weight stigma that like, oh, you shouldn't be eating that. Like you're eating intuitively. That's not good for you kind of thing. And so it's really hard. And again, kind of pushing back on this like cyclical diet culture involvement. And intuitive eating as a framework is very different. It can be really hard for some people to kind of get on board with. So just like acknowledging that right out of the gate. So fact or myth? Intuitive eating just means eating whatever you want, whenever you want. Myth. Oh man. Y'all, Great. Perfect. You already know the stuff. My job is done here. Just kidding. Myth: intuitive eating is comprised of multiple adaptive eating behaviors, and it's often used as part of interventions that are aimed at improving health. And there are a lot of like overlaps between intuitive eating and mindful eating that you're going to notice, but there's also some differences. I think one thing to keep in mind here is that mindful eating tends to refer to like a designated intentional practice, and intuitive eating tends to refer to like an overall eating framework style, but also is these behaviors that are adaptive. Okay. So some main components of intuitive eating. Listen, y'all, depending on where you go in the world, in the research, there's a lot of different frameworks for intuitive eating. But over the course of looking at the research, you know, people that are trying to study intuitive eating, it's really hard to study something that has like 10 different subsets. Like probably the most well-known one is from Tribble and Resch, which has like 10 different subcomponents. That's really hard to study every single one of those individual components. So other researchers have developed these tools to kind of condense down the main components of intuitive eating as an adaptive eating style. And so I went with the smaller ones because I have a limited window of time, and that 10 fit really poorly on a slide. So primary components of intuitive eating is this unconditional permission to eat when hungry and to eat what food is desired. And also includes eating for physical rather than emotional reasons. And it really, this reliance on internal hunger and satiety cues, so internal hunger and fullness cues to determine when to eat and also how much to eat. And then there's also this component of honoring one's health and gentle nutrition. In general, intuitive eating is this defined as having a really strong connection with physiological hunger and satiety cues and eating in response to those. And, you know, people who eat intuitively aren't ruminating about food or diet, or, you know, we're not classifying foods into good or bad categories. Also, yeah, that picture, I saw it and I was like, that's the cutest thing to grace my eyeballs all day. So it's going in the slides. That turtle eaten intuitively. You know, we're not ignoring hunger cues, but instead they're people who are eating intuitively are selecting foods that they enjoy. This turtle, very much enjoying that strawberry, but also foods that enable their bodies to function optimally too. And relying on those, again, those internal cues to determine when and how much to eat, and respecting those too, like, you know, stopping eating when we're comfortably full. And some frameworks of intuitive eating also include this explicitly anti-diet mindset. Others don't. Tribble and Resch, again, probably the most popular one, they really hone this anti-diet mindset, although I think it is possible to be following not necessarily like a strict prescriptive diet, but like following a general overall healthy eating pattern that might have some constraints around, you know, I think about like people who are maybe on a DASH diet or some kind of thing like that can still eat intuitively, because again, it's about the overall pattern and tuning into those bodily cues as well. Touching back on those 10 components, Tribble and Resch, again, probably most well known. They have some things about, you know, honoring your hunger, making peace with food, not engaging in those good bad dichotomous food things. So let's talk about some of the benefits of intuitive eating, maybe, if I can advance the slide. Okay, there it goes. Overall, from the research, the most well-supported benefits of intuitive eating are the the psychological benefits, body satisfaction and body image, overall mental well-being scores, including things like anxiety, mood, depression, people who eat intuitively and people who complete like intuitive eating programs or interventions pretty consistently tend to score higher on all of those things. And again, those are really important for your health, regardless of what your weight status is, or even necessarily what your diet, what food you're intaking. Those are all super important. Intuitive eaters also tend to generally have a lower body mass index. This is a little bit mixed. Intuitive eating for weight loss, I guess we're going to touch on that in the next slide, but I'll come back to that. Intuitive eating also does seem to help people maintain a consistent weight and reduce this weight cycling, going up and then down and then back and forth. That's really common with like yo-yo dieting or fad dieting. Though because it's not specifically aimed at weight loss, when people start eating intuitively, they could gain weight. They might lose weight, kind of just depending on where their eating habits were before. Again, tuning into those bodily cues, right? Maybe you were under eating. Maybe you were overindulging, eating past the point of comfortable fullness consistently. And also here with this weight maintenance piece, I think it's important to note too that most people's weight fluctuates over the course of our lives. It's influenced by a lot of different things: age, hormones, stress, environment, and so eating intuitively, it's possible to eat intuitively and still have the weight fluctuate or cycle as well. Also, intuitive eating seems to be associated with a greater diet variety. So like eating more types of foods, as well as a higher overall diet quality. The data is a little bit mixed on what exactly why. In some studies, they found that intuitive eaters have more, like eat more fruits and vegetables, consume less sugar sweetened beverages. In others, it's kind of different. And there's very often sex differences in what that looks like as well. So women who eat intuitively, their intuitive eating tends to result in different benefits for them than for men, which is really interesting. And I think is kind of points to the complexity of nutrition and weight and food and how we eat. Okay, so there are some limitations. Like most things, we need more diverse study samples and we need more robust study designs. A lot of the available data on intuitive eating is gathered from young, primarily white women in college settings. Now, young women in general are at higher risk for disordered eating and eating disorders than the general population. So like that kind of makes sense. But at the same time, we need to know more. We need to know more. It would strengthen this body of research. Again, there are sex differences in intuitive eating and between men and women. And so it would be really great for us to be able to kind of tease some more of that out. Also, the representation of intuitive eating in media and like social media in particular, there's been literal studies done that is very skewed towards representing thin white women who, yeah, that's, everybody ideally should be able to eat intuitively. We want everybody to be able to adapt or adopt some of these adaptive eating styles and eating habits associated with intuitive eating. So it would be excellent if we saw more representation. We also need to talk about food insecurity. As somebody who works in food access and the emergency food systems, you can't eat intuitively if you don't have access to food. You can't eat intuitively if your primary source or one of your sources of food is, coming from a food shelf or a food pantry that pre-packs a box and then gives it to you. That just is the reality. And that makes it really hard because, again, these adaptive eating habits are really beneficial to people but there are people who are limited by that. And actually some recent research from U of M looked at, teenagers growing up in in households and differences between intuitive eating and parents and kids, and pretty consistently low socioeconomic status families tended to have lower intuitive eating scores. Again, food access, and that has ramifications going forward in life as well. There's also this part that there's some chicken and egg stuff with intuitive eating and body image, and if intuitive eaters tend to have a lower BMI and tend to be higher socioeconomic status, then their bodies are also probably already more socially acceptable. And so it makes sense that they would have improved body image compared to people who don't. So there's it's all intricate, it's complex, it's nuanced. It's hard for us to just be like, yes, definitive, the thing. But we can definitely identify some trends there. And that food security piece also touches on the barriers to broader implementation. Again, hard for us to really generalize and say everybody should just go and eat intuitively. Well, there are people who can't eat intuitively, and for some people, they may need support trying intuitive eating on their own, whether that is from having a history of an eating disorder or really severe disordered eating, finding support to be able to implement that. But then there are also a lot of people who maybe aren't able to tune into their bodily cues and tune into hunger and fullness, and maybe have more challenges getting in touch with that part of themselves, which would inherently prevent them from eating intuitively. And I see this a lot with people who are in substance use recovery. A lot of times the bodily cues are kind of blunted by a history of substance use. And so it can be hard for them to, I didn't realize I was hungry, so how do I eat intuitively? So they might need more structure and more adaptation for implementing that. And also for people who, don't have an appetite, whether that's from a medication or whatever, how can you eat if you're not hungry for anything, if nothing sounds good? And that's part of intuitive eating, is eating what sounds good to you. How do you do that then? So there's a lot of nuance to this, right? And a lot of challenges. So we're wrapping up here, and it's going to be wrapping up pretty early, but yeah, teasing out the emotional eating part seems to be the hardest. Yes, it does take some real work. And I also think it's important to note here too that emotional eating in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It is, it's first of all, it's normal. And second of all, it can be a useful coping skill for people. If we have a coping skill toolbox, though, that is limited and really only contains emotional eating as a way to deal with stressors and that kind of thing, then it's a little bit trickier. How do we deal with those things? And also for some people, emotional eating can be really important. And I think particularly for people who aren't as in touch with their bodily cues for whatever reason, that can be, how can we teach our kids mindful eating and intuitive eating? There are some great resources online, and I'm thinking primarily of some social media accounts that I follow, and I hate to be just go to this social media account, but I think there are some tools online for that.
And we can maybe, sorry, I was
Oh.
going to say, we can maybe include a couple of links in our follow-up email too.
Yeah.
I'll wait maybe till tomorrow to send out our follow-up email with the, why can't I think, the link to the playlist, there we go, for the webinar recording, but we can include a couple of additional resources for you all.
Yeah. And I think, Julia, to your question, how do you distinguish intuitive eating from simple craving for something bad for you? that kind of goes back to that unconditional permission to eat part, right? Allowing ourselves to indulge, allowing ourselves to eat some of those things is actually really important to preventing binging. And I think there is this this restriction binge cycle. Like if I tell you not to eat cupcakes, what are you going to think about all day? You're going to think about stinking cupcakes, right? And then what's going to happen when you encounter those cupcakes? Or you go to the store and you buy a pack of them, and then there tends to be this overconsumption. And so there tends to be this, like, particularly when people, thanks for mentioning cupcakes, you're welcome. I'm actually a little mad. I normally bring a little sweet something to eat after lunch, and I didn't today. And that's what I'm going to be thinking about. I'm going to be like, I need to go get some Sour Patch Kids or something. Because having those things prevents us from overindulging in them later or binging on them later. But Nikki, did you have a point to that?
Not to that one, but I was going back to the kids portion about mindful eating and intuitive eating. And I think about teaching my own kids about healthy eating habits and some of maybe my missteps where, the Clean Plate Club, like telling me you're not leaving the dinner table until you've eaten all of this, despite the fact that they may be like, Mom, I'm not hungry. So some I think of teaching your kids about mindful eating and intuitive eating is thinking about how you are talking or how you are, what the dinner table looks like or that experience looks like. So some of it's like maybe retraining the parent a little bit, and not like explicitly stating to the kid a certain comment or something like that, but it's maybe, reframing some of my own thoughts and actions to better reflect a mindful eating practice or an intuitive eating practice.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of really good stuff going on in the chat here. And this is great. Yeah, having the snacks available. Kids in general do tend to eat intuitively, I think, but there's also, like, it's hard because their eating habits are still influenced by what is modeled to them. And so sometimes, like Nikki just said, retraining the parent, it's like, we got to be in touch with our own selves and what we're doing around kids before we tell them to do something different than what we're doing. Because anybody that has said something around a kid only to hear it repeated later, and then we tell them, no, you're not allowed to say that, that tends to be how that goes. Yeah, and also this portion about some stuff at the grocery store. Yeah, and thinking about those things, which is why I'm dragging my partner along in this journey. I love to see it. Great. So I just want to, the last couple take home points for y'all is that adapting eating styles can improve your health beyond just what you're eating, beyond nutrition and beyond weight status. We know that, like, weight status isn't a great indicator of overall health anyway, and that people can be healthy regardless of where they're at with food. And even just building in some small pieces of these mindful eating or intuitive eating could be really beneficial for people. And also that these are behaviors and skills that can be learned, but might be hard to learn. And recognizing that there might be some discomfort in challenging maybe the kind of ingrained ways that we've thought about and interacted with food. It could be really difficult to apply for many. We don't eat food in a vacuum. You are very much influenced by your environment, what's available to you, what you can afford to buy, that kind of stuff all plays into this. But in general, they are really low risk interventions. And I would love to continue to see more research and new research. There are some longitudinal studies being done now, and looking at how this could impact, children and teens into young adulthood. But yeah, with nutrition, it's hard. I always want to see more research, but nutrition is a long game, right? Like nutrition isn't just a snapshot. Nutrition is the culmination of a ton of different factors over the long periods of time, which can make it hard to study, even though it's super important. Nikki, I don't know if you had anything else, and or we can just keep this open for chats and for questions for people,
Yeah,
since we're done a little early.
I think we should keep it open for some chats or questions if anybody has those. For those of you that do need to head out, know that we, as always, have an option for a certificate of participation as well as some well-being points. In order to receive either of those options, we do ask that you complete the evaluation that was just added to the chat. And again, this just gives us a little bit more information about what you enjoyed about our webinars, as well as gives an opportunity to provide feedback for any ideas for upcoming webinars you'd like to see. And we've gotten some phenomenal options, I think, on some of our previous ones. And just know that while our Truth About Nutrition series is complete for the month of March, there's way more opportunities to learn and other topics to see. These are our webinar series for the duration of March and April, but there will be a notice for our upcoming webinars for May through August, I think is our next round. I can't even remember anymore, but the upcoming months. As always, to see more information about those webinars, you can definitely seek us out here or engage with us on social media to be able to get connected in other ways. And again, thanks all for joining. We will stick around for some questions if there are any.
Thank you guys. That was great.
Thanks,
Thank
Margaret.
you.